Welcome to the Teens Talk podcast, created by the Student Virtual Board of You Celebrate Diversity. You Celebrate Diversity supports students and teachers organizing locally, educating themselves and their peers, and taking action for inclusion and social justice. For more information, visit ycdiversity.org. Welcome back to Season 2, which is all about community building. Today, I'm joined with Rohan Guddanti to discuss how to create and uphold a community space. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Teens Talk. This season's about community building. I'm Lameese Makkawi. I'm a virtual intern for You Celebrate Diversity, and we'll just get right into it. So, everyone needs community, and it can look different from all over the world. The important thing is building a community with the right intention, as well as understanding the possible obstacles you could face. So, I wanted to give my co-facilitator a chance to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Rohan Guddanti. I was part of Youth Celebrate Diversity from my freshman year of high school to my senior year of high school, so from 2018 until 2022. And the work I did was mostly with what's now called the Colorado Student Board. When I joined, it was called the Student Executive Committee in planning the Colorado Youth Diversity Conference. So I had the lovely opportunity to be part of the board for 3 years, and then I got to be co-chair my senior year, which was awesome. And then I've also done other work for YCD, including being part of their virtual student board in 2020.
Thank you. So I've had the pleasure of actually being able to know Rohan since middle school. He's insanely talented and educated beyond wise. And I really was excited to be able to sit down with him today to have this conversation. Because I think that our topic for today is how to go about starting a club or starting a space or community, any kind of way you want to phrase it, because there's a real obstacles. In the last episode, we talked about opposition and activism. This does touch on that a little bit, but it does provide a wider kind of lens and view on specifically how to create these spaces. And so I actually remember in our previous conversation just talking about this topic, you talking about some of the things you look for when trying to join a space. And I was hoping you would share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that you should look for in a space is how they honor you and your healing, and also how they honor you as a person. So I think a big thing with that is how they respect and value your voice. That's one of the reasons I joined YCD, and specifically why I joined the executive committee, was because it was student led, and they made it very clear that they thought it was student voices that were most important when it came to uplifting and honoring other youth. They really prioritized that. Similarly, I'm part of a socio-political organization that's based in Aurora called YASPA, Young Aspiring Americans for Socio-Political Activism. And one of the reasons I was really big on joining is because they are very focused on centering youth. So if something is ever not in your capacity to do, you can always highlight that. They sign you up with a healing centered engagement instructor, so that you can like really focus on your healing as well. And they really prioritize youth voices. They always make sure that youth get to speak in the spaces that they put on, and adults always take a step back. And I think that for me was important. Of course, also just making sure that the organizations you're part of align with your values. Of course, I joined YASPA because they're very clear about defying white supremacist culture and not tying us down to that. So, for example, they don't put you in any sort of contract, and that's sort of one way to defy white supremacist culture. And then I think with Youth Celebrate Diversity, of course, they're really focused on making a difference for all types of youth. And I think that was something that really drew me to it, to see that like there was an organization where I could teach so many youth about diversity.
No, I really like that you brought that up, because that fact about having somebody let the youth lead while they kind of sit back, that was the nice thing about YCD, was that like that was the first time I was kind of pushed to just make my own decisions, because I'm so used to being like, well, what do I do now? Like, and it was a nice push to, I kind of instill some confidence in me with decision-making skills, especially with trying to hear directly from the youth what they need instead of adults trying to make assumptions about that. But when you said somebody that's trying to look out for you and like respect you, having your best interest in mind. Have you ever had a space where somebody didn't do that? And could you provide maybe an example of that? Just because I want anyone who's like listening, or watching to see maybe in real time when they actually might be disrespected or not taken seriously without them even realizing it. Because some people are so good at, being passive aggressive or like, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Right. Um, I would say this is less about the space itself and more about the implications of being a part of the space. But in my high school, I had the opportunity to join diversity leadership team, which was kind of like our club for promoting racial equity. And my freshman year, we would do these round tables, which was where we'd sit with teachers and we would talk about diversity work. And we actually put a stop to that after my freshman year. And the reason for that was because it was made very clear to us that teachers were not going to respect our opinion as youth. So, for example, when we would bring up certain things the teachers had done that had hurt us, we would get a lot of pushback from teachers and blatant disrespect of our voices. Um, I think on top of that, many teachers would go up to students after the roundtables and not only side eye them, but tell them like, do you believe in, what you talked about today? Or do you understand the harm of what you've done? The harm just being that we had sort of called out their racist behavior. Um, and we did try and take steps to sort of curb that. Like teachers, we had our sponsors meet with those teachers to sort of talk about the fact that what they were doing wasn't okay. But even with that still happening, teachers were still coming up to students and targeting them after the roundtables had happened. And I think because of that, we put a stop to the space because thankfully we had sponsors who knew that it wasn't healthy for us as youth to have that sort of disrespect put onto us, and because we knew that the teachers themselves wouldn't stop harassing students.
No, that's actually something I don't think. I remember we talked about it in the last episode too, but like a lot of the time, people, especially like figures, adults, anybody that has a certain kind of power over you, will try to like scare you away from doing the right thing, and they're sometimes straight up lie about like the consequences that could happen should you do said thing, because you have rights which you don't even know until you're like old enough to really understand what students' rights are. But I actually had a similar experience with me because I remember getting called in before and getting in trouble for simply having a conversation, literally just or like it was heated, yeah, but it wasn't any way violent. And it was about just slavery and the Confederate flag. And I was simply trying to explain why like some of the opinions around that this other person was sharing were problematic, and just trying to have a conversation to get through to each other. But I was the one getting in trouble saying, oh, well, if people saw that, like it'll start issues and it's scary for them. Of course it's scary for them. How could you do that? Da-da-da, whatever. And it got to a point where I seriously didn't know if my voice was enough anymore. I didn't know if I was actually causing issues. Like I really truly couldn't figure out how to go about doing things anymore, because it seemed like any approach I took was still problematic, until one day I learned the issue is that nobody wants to talk about these things, that confrontation in itself is an issue for them. So I remember us talking about you being able to kind of combat that with powerful figures, if you will. So I remember you talking about like some of the school district board members and some of the issues you came across with that, and how you were able to kind of get around some of those roadblocks. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say like I think I even remember those conversations happening. I think I remember what you're talking about. And yeah, like that's not okay. And I think a lot of administration tend to side with the oppressor, unfortunately. So that first of all, that was not okay. And I'm glad that you said what was right. And second of all, yeah. So with YASPA specifically, they're very youth oriented. And so we were doing a school board candidate workshop. So this was in 2021 when the Cherry Creek District school board elections were about to happen. And one thing that YASPA knew, and something that like now I understand, is that if there's one thing that school board members love doing, they love to use their power, specifically their power to speak, to sort of skirt around controversial issues and hide the fact that they are maintaining oppressive structures. And so one thing that we did was, first of all, we put a time limit on them. I think it was like 2 or 3 minutes, which if you've ever been to a school board meeting, that's not a lot for for school board candidates. They will talk for 10, 15 minutes to sort of really just so you get lost in what they're saying and don't understand what they're actually trying to say, which is usually that they are sort of on the side of the oppressor. And so we would ask them very difficult questions. Like one thing that we brought up was the fact that a lot of administration at our school at the time, I went to Smoky Hill High School, were siding with students who were engaging in extremely racist behavior and not punishing them, and instead punishing the students who were taking a stand against it. And we only gave them 2 or 3 minutes to answer the question. And what that did was they couldn't really waffle around the question. They actually had to get to the point. And I think that inspired a lot more sincere answers. And in some ways, that was good. I think we got a lot more of a definitive stance against racism. But at the same time, I think we got promises for action that I think we would not have gotten otherwise because they really had to convey their point in 2 to 3 minutes. Where it honestly you could see that they disliked their loss of power a little bit was that we called it, I think, something like a rapid fire round. And we were asking them questions that should very easily be answered with yes or no. And what you answer about saying yes or no is indicative of, like how you feel about sort of defying these like oppressive status quo norms. So the whole point was that they could only say yes or no, no maybes, and that they couldn't elaborate on their answer. And the reason we did that is because we had questions like, do you support critical race theory? If you go up to a school board candidate and ask them that, the answer is no, but they're going to give you like a 15-20 minute lecture about like why they still care about why they still care about students of color, even though, like they're very much going against things that are necessary for students of color to feel understood. So when we did that yes or no, they answered no and they couldn't really explain why. And I think to them that felt like uncomfortable because they didn't have the power to sort of like waffle their way around answers. But for us, it was very impactful. And I think for the people who were attending, it was very impactful because you could see in a snapshot, like if they had to choose the side of the oppressor, that they would. Because, when you say that you don't support critical race theory, what you're really saying is that like, I'm not comfortable talking about the fact that race is systemic. And there are other questions like that, but I think that was really impactful and powerful for me because they're putting our voice as youth first. Um, and they sort of taught us like with figures of authority, you can still assert your power as youth, and you don't have to fall into these structures where you don't get any promises or any action done.
No, I think that was perfectly put. Honestly, as somebody who's, been asked to do a lot of different kinds of programs, board meetings, whatever, I've gotten so exhausted of trying to like I think it's funny because they'll try to act like they're helping you and that the words they choose to use, the language they use, the tone, the way that you said they dance around the topic, tries to confuse everyone. And then you try to say, oh, you didn't answer the question, but they're like, no, I did though. And it's like, I personally want to have way more authentic relationships with the people I'm trying to build and create spaces with, but it's so hard to do that when you don't feel like they're really on your side. And so going back to the essential idea of like creating a space, I remember in the first episode we talked a bit more about like ground rules and like all the ways to do that. But for you, what are some things, I know you talked about some of the things you look for in joining a space, but what are the things you try to make sure are implemented when creating a space?
Right. I think one of the big things is ground rules, and I think that's something we did in YCD too. I think those sort of norms are important because I think you have people creating the space that they want to be a part of. And I think that's honestly, it's incredibly impactful to have that because then you have students who feel like they're actively part of the space and actively heard. But I think you can also sort of set a tone for these are the things we are going to do and help ensure that it's a place where people can feel heard. So for example, it could be small things like we respect pronouns here and you're making a safe space. It could also be things like we're not going to talk over other people. We're going to let everyone talk. And if we speak 3 times, we're going to like, wait and then have other people talk as well. It could be things like assuming good intent and hearing people before you fight back, because when you're in an argument, I think it's very easy, especially when it comes to difficult topic, to start formulating an answer in your mind the moment someone starts talking. And I think that can get in the way of like learning about why certain things are problematic. So that sort of thing. And I think also the types of things that you do, the activities that you do. Like one thing that I love about whenever I ask the spaces, which is the Aurora Youth Coalition, is that we have the freedom to create our own projects with the support of the kind of knowledge that YASPA has. So, we have the power to start a research project on teachers of color. And I think that's something that a lot of students like feel like maybe they wouldn't be capable of doing, or they feel overwhelmed with. And I think creating a space for them to really explore that is important. And I think also the sort of like language that you use when you're creating a space is important too. One of the things that I really loved about YASPA was they taught us about using language that is affirmative and powerful. So, for example, instead of saying the word minority, which sort of implies that like people of color are minor, we say minoritized, because um, in America, due to genocide and population replacement, people of color became minoritized, but are not any inferior. And that was one thing that is like, okay, I really feel respected here and I feel empowered. So those are, I think, certain ways that you can sort of create a space where people are like, okay, I feel respected here. I feel comfortable here.
No, I love that. I actually think changing language a lot of the time is going to also change your thought process, because if you're always telling yourself one thing, it's not, I'm not saying you directly become that, but you truly believe that's what you are. And I like, I've never really heard the minoritized thing before, so I really like that. I like that they like, intentionally change that because of, the connotation that comes with it. So I mean, going off of that, what when you touched on maybe having somebody in the space that just might not be aware of what they're saying, that might be problematic, or anything like that, or maybe not be like caught up on all the language that we might use today, how do you think the best way to go about that is, like, having somebody in a space where they're just
Mhm.
not really getting it, but they are unintentionally harming other people around them, or kind of causing maybe some heat, like issues or some heated topics. How do you kind of tackle that and try to help them, help educate them without making them feel targeted? Because that tends to be an issue when I try to like educate somebody who's kind of doing that thing, but also trying to set a tone for anybody else who might slip up in the future.
Right. I think one thing that you can really do is focus on education. So, and like, and I think when we say education, I think sometimes people sort of don't connect with people because the people they're trying to educate feel, I guess, like they're being belittled in some way, which might say more about them than the person that's actually doing the educating. But I think if you try and maintain a respectful tone and be like, let's have a conversation about this, let's talk about like why other people are finding it problematic. And I think highlighting the way that you're harming people or hurting people with the language you're using, I think can also sort of shift the conversation from what someone might perceive as an attack on them to more like creating a space of respect. Um, and there's multiple ways you can approach that. If you're in a situation where like people in the moment are being disrespected or hurt in some way, I think it's perfectly reasonable to step in and be like, hey, what just happened here, what you just said is not okay at all. And we can have a conversation about it. But for right now, you just need to stop using that language. And another approach you can take is to talk with someone one on one later on, just so that they don't have the power dynamic of being called out in like a larger space. Um, and I think that's one way you can approach it. And I think also sort of taking on a tone of like explaining to them and less of a reprimand, because like I've slipped up before, for example. Like I remember we were even when we were like reading To Kill a Mockingbird, I used language that wasn't appropriate. And I think for me, one of the reasons I was able to reflect on it more was because I think I had a teacher who kind of was like, this is not appropriate language to use. It has this connotation, more so than assuming. that I came in with ill intentions or to hurt people. And I think that helped me a lot in just like learning not to use that language. That's not to say though, I feel like sometimes when people say that, I think it gets confused with almost like sympathizing with the oppressor. And I don't think that that's the approach you should take. I definitely think if accountability needs to happen, there should be accountability. And I think if someone is repeatedly, like maybe multiple times demonstrated, that they can't respect you or that they're not respecting people in the space, that might be time to have a discussion about a boundary of some sort. Um, so that's not to say that, you should do like educate other people at the expense of your own well-being. And that's not to say that you should almost sympathize with people who are, like standing on injustice over the people who are standing for what's right. Um, but I do think that like if you focus more on education, and really helping people understand the error in their ways, I think that can really be helpful. So hopefully that makes sense.
No, that was perfectly put. I really agree with you on, like, me personally, I, in a space that I created, in a community that I created, I will of course try to always take the approach of educating the person and not just, villainizing them right away, because I come from people and am surrounded by people that come from all different walks of life and have very different types of education, are conditioned in different environments, and a lot of them have good intentions and a good heart, but they truly don't understand what they're saying sometimes, or they're so what's it called, so sure about what they were told that they're not like not open to changing their mindset on a couple of things, but they're a little hesitant to understand why. And so for me personally, I will go about, trying to understand them, trying to be like, okay, like this is why, but at the same time, I don't do that with every single person because it does get exhausting and it's not my job. And that's actually something we touched on in the last episode of having admin or any teachers or anything put that responsibility on us to change the school dynamic, to be like, oh, well, if there's this issue, why don't you do something about it? But the whole point is that it's affecting me and I wish I could just focus on school. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know why I'm supposed to start a movement because of something I was affected by. And I'm always, down to, I love,
Mhm.
I truly respect activism in all forms, but I don't want it to become the center of everything in my life to the point that I don't have room or space for me or people that I don't just focus on, other things. And so I wanted to ask about, I was also glad you brought up the accountability thing, because I also feel like some people there's like a spectrum to it. I feel like some people are
Mhm.
like, tell them accountable, do this. And I totally agree. But sometimes I think, this whole like conversation around being like a snowflake or
Mhm.
liberal culture, blue hair liberals, whatever you want to call it, all the things you could hear about. I personally tried to be a bit more open-minded as I grow up, just to see what's going on, maybe to see why there's such like why there's so much division between I guess people who are in the kind of in conversations that have to do with politics or activism or anything. And I think a lot of it comes down to the language, right? Like a lot of progressive people want to use progressive language to have more
Mhm.
inclusivity for anyone, and I think to me that's never really been an issue, but to other people, they find it exhausting. They think, oh, like everything's problematic now, like, oh, the woke police, whatever. And my thing is, I'm trying to find a way to actively combat that with anybody I come across in these spaces, because I want there to be like a real opportunity for connection and understanding. But I also have noticed that just calling them, unless they of course are racist, like that's the thing. I also don't want to say like, oh, you should, like you said, don't
Mhm.
sympathize with the oppressor. But I'm just saying, if
Mhm.
that's not the case, I think that calling them names right away or assuming things right about them right away is also part of the problem. And so I wanted to
Right.
also ask you, like, in creating these spaces, what were some of the struggles you came across, besides having district school board members or admin kind of talk circles around you? What are some other struggles you came across when trying to kind of make this like a real movement?
Right. This sort of brings me back to this does involve admin again, but I think a lot of what happened was a tokenization. So like as part of a diversity leadership team, and this sort of connects to what you brought up, there was a lot of Black activists who were part of that space. and our school would sort of like put the responsibility on them to do that. So like I remember I had a friend, her name's Brandy, and what happened was like her Stugo teacher asked her to run the social media account for the school for Black History Week. So that's one thing. It's like, and sort of like you brought up, don't let people tokenize you. Like, and one thing that you can do is remind them that like they have a responsibility to do this work too. So like if someone comes up to you, for example, and it says like, hey, can you plan this event and blah 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 for us? You can be like, you have the resources too, like you have the money too. You definitely have a lot of tools at your disposal to. Why are you asking me? Um, because like, for example, our school has all the resources they need to plan things for Black History Month. So don't let them feel like don't let them make you feel like you have to do something. Is the first thing I want to say. And I think the other thing that sort of happened was there was a lot of roadblocks that sort of came up, and I think a lot of that has to do with sort of the red tape and the politics around school. Like I remember one thing that happened was we wanted to have conversations about police brutality and anti-blackness. And we wanted to couple that with announcements that talked about those sort of things. And what happened was the announcement didn't get approved by the administration, and it was about like Black Lives Matter and police brutality. And the logic was you can't just say that without having a conversation about it. But the irony was, um, at the same time, like when we tried to set up conversations about it, we got shut down and said they're like, maybe you could do this as a writing exercise. And we thought that was ironic because we were calling it Stop the Silence. And if you're having people sitting there writing, you're just creating silence. So that was one thing that was sort of difficult. And I think a tool that we used was accountability. You can hold administration accountable. In fact, you should hold administration accountable. And one way we did that was with the help of YASPA and with the help of the NAACP, we got a interview with the Aurora Sentinel. And that was really helpful because we talked about those things. We talked about the fact that we were worried that the administration would take credit for the week. We talked about the fact that we hadn't been approved for either announcement or conversation and sort of hypocrisy around that. And I think that was important because I think the next year it opened up more conversation because I think the administration realized if we do these sort of hypocritical things, we can't just sort of like sweep it under the rug. And I've seen that in sort of similar ways with like other things that we tried to do. So this happened over multiple years. The Black History Spirit Week, we planned it multiple times. Um, and I remember one of the things that we did when we first did it was that we wanted to have a Black Hair Care Day, but at the time, do-rags were banned. And I think one thing that we really focused on was like using our voices and like the power in our voices to sort of challenge that. So we got a meeting with the principal, and a lot of the Black activists there explained why do-rag is significant to Black hair and why it's racist to associate it with gang symbols, which is the reason that the district had banned it. And I think that sort of helped us lift the ban and have that celebration. And I think again, like challenging and holding administration accountable helped create that change. And I've seen that in other ways too. Um, if you were part of the Cherry Creek School District last year, you probably know that there was a lot of protests around sexual assault. And I think a conversation for the first time about the district sort of changing their policies around it. Um, what was interesting was that that was like actually not the first protest that happened that year. That happened at Grandview in I think like March, April. We had a similar protest in December of that year, and the protest wasn't very like public. It wasn't really covered by like the media or anything like that. And so because of that, administrations sort of were able to get away with more, meaning that they were able to, for example, they prevented the person who planned the whole thing from even like showing up to the protest, and they sent them home. And then um they refused to give us any sort of resources. They didn't give us a mic or anything like that. Um, and a lot of administration showed a lot of apathy to it. They refused to come up and speak. We asked them, why aren't you coming near us? They're like, we don't want to be associated with this protest. We don't want people to think we're part of the protest. And I remember students came up and shared their stories, and they would talk to their dean who was sitting over there, and they're like, do you remember this? And they would say no, because I guess to them it wasn't important. The principal refused to come out too. And that was all just because there wasn't a sense of accountability, I think, that was held in place. Whereas with the bigger protest and with the sort of like media coverage that happened, there was more of a sense of accountability. And I think the district was more willing to do something about it. Um, so I think all that to say that, like, standing in your voice and standing in your power, and also especially with power structures, challenging them and pushing accountability, I think is really important, because a lot of what people rely on when they're sort of trampling you is they rely on A, you backing down, and B, you feeling like you can't speak out or like protest. They rely on the fact that you buy into their power. And I think if you sort of defy that, I think that's when they start to realize, okay, we can't skirt around this.
No, thank you. I totally agree with that last statement too, because I've found that they try to instill fear in you and thinking that you're gonna like run away from the problem. They try to like straight up lie to you and be like, oh well, you can't do this, this, and this. But the minute, in my experience at least, that I was very, very vocal and just adamant about certain things being changed, that's when adults started taking me way more seriously, because they understood that this would not end until they actually did something about it. Because one thing I've noticed, and it's everything you said, and this episode's gonna we talk about admin a lot, because that tends to be the issue, honestly, when creating spaces. It's not, in any kind of thing you do, you're always going to have to kind of answer to someone, right? And for me, I've been lucky enough that the people that sponsored my club that I created in school, or any of the programs I've been a part of, have all been educated adults with clear intentions that, they're trying to actually help us. And that's what I liked. I didn't want somebody to use me. One thing I hated is that I felt a lot of the time that certain groups of people would use my school as a poster kids for diversity. Like, they didn't really care what we had to say. They didn't really respect us. They honestly, nothing changed that much, because as long as they knew that, they had our school to be like, hey, we're woke, don't worry, like, we literally have this, like, this is the most diverse school in the district. It really annoyed me, because I felt so neglected, even though there was some attention on us, and I felt like my voice really didn't have any power. And that's one thing I think people have an issue with, is they do want things to change, but they don't see the point anymore, because every time they try to do something, nothing happens, and they're honestly exhausted of it. And I remember us touching a bit about how you said in your own words that activism is draining. And I totally resonated with that, because it really is exhausting. It's not easy. It's not,
Mhm.
I can understand if, you already have the mentality and mindset of trying to be progressive and trying to, I guess make some change. But either way, things you have to, that followed with that has to be real steps for action. And
Mhm.
those steps can be insanely exhausting, especially when you have constant opposition all the time. And so I wanted to talk a bit more about that. And maybe if you or any people around you in these spaces that you've joined or created, how did you guys go about trying to continue to do the work without, by and still trying to respect yourself and your mental health?
Yeah. I think first of all, rest is important. And if that's something that you need, you can absolutely take it. And just because you take rest doesn't mean that you're not committed to the work of social justice. And just because you take rest does not mean that does not mean that like you're like giving up on the cause. In fact, taking rest is a form of activism, because activism, or rather the oppressor, one of the things they rely on is trying to drain it out of you. And if you take rest, it's harder to do that. Um, so definitely like be okay with taking those breaks. I think another thing is, I think sort of understanding what you're doing it for can be really, really helpful. Um, so like I think relying on empathy. I do a lot of activism work because I know what it's like to be sort of like belittled and attacked for my own identities. For example, like being made fun of because of my culture and for my skin color. And so I keep going because I know that there are like other little South Asian boys just like me who could face the same thing and I don't want them to. And that's one thing that really keeps me going. And I think if you find that sort of purpose or that drive, that's one thing that can really help keep you going. Like you have a reason to keep going. Um, and I think that's something that can guide you for sure. Something you can think about when you're like, well, why am I doing this? Um, I think something else that's important is to not let sort of like people in power have control over you. And this sort of goes back to again challenging their mindset. But for example, one thing that I would say is like I think organizations like YCD or YASP are important because if you find that you're facing a lot of like red tape and things like that in school, I think places like YCD and YASPA can be refreshing because you see that you can make changes and that you can educate youth and you don't have to face all that red tape. And I think that's why um, organizations like these are so important because they provide a resource for students to go to when they really feel like they can't make a change. This sort of shows them that they can make a change and provides them with the resources to do it. So those are some of the tips that I would use.
Thank you. Bouncing off of what you're saying, I also, really agree with just trying to, I think one thing I found is that people only try to help you or respect you if you're palatable enough for them. So if for somebody like me who I like to express myself through, how I dress or, jewelry, whatever, what I say, the thing is I'm also very blunt in some of these like board meetings or anything because I simply don't have the energy anymore to dance around certain, use flowery words all the time because sometimes you just got to get to it. Like I know we were talking about language and using progressive language and all that. I totally believe that you need to use certain language out of respect, human decency, and just to actually make sure whatever you're saying is correct. I'm not saying you have to be. I'm also sick of everyone saying like, oh, why is everything so PC? It's really not that hard to use a couple terms that mean the exact same thing you're trying to say, right? It's not out, it's not insane, right? My thing is though, I also don't want to get to a point where we lose our authenticity, right? Where I have to
Right.
sit up straight and act like I think this and that simply to get you to respect me because as I'm still learning a lot, and as somebody who's still in school, I've barely hit the tip of education
Mhm.
around any kind of movements. I'm still learning a lot, and my thing is, I think for me, uh, I've noticed that. I've noticed that when I
Mhm.
would talk to these people, it was almost like I would code switch right away. I would just code switch, and it made me feel so gross. Honestly, I didn't like it. I don't like to code switch. I still do it even now. I do it all the time because it's just what I'm used to. But I feel like at the same time, I personally want to be in a space where they actually value me, not this
Right.
persona I created. I want them to value me. And I think when you learn more about abolitionists and all these other things, like the whole
Mhm.
thing is that you have to reset the system. You can't keep, always working within it and trying to,
Mhm.
move through that because that's the whole point is that the entire system is corrupt anyways. And so that's why I really like, and I don't want to like be like, oh, Gen Z, everything. I know everyone talks a lot about, Gen Z being a powerhouse, and I agree, but I also think that maybe we're just being real. You know what I mean? Like, I think in some ways, yes, we're definitely breaking the glass ceiling. In some ways, we're definitely, pushing the needle forward. But I think in other ways, we're literally just being authentic. And I think that it's sad to think, to see that that's not really a norm. And so, continuing off of that, I want to talk a bit more of the benefits you had from creating these spaces and the benefits you've seen in other people from joining them.
Yeah. I think one thing that's really helpful is it really um gives you the power to sort of like be your like you said, be your authentic self. Um, I've had other people say that like I joined a lot of these organizations, the timid little freshman who was very scared to say anything. And now I feel a lot more empowered to stand up in these times of injustices and like say expose oppression, for example, from administration to other people, to news sources, for example. And I think that was one thing that I really saw, and even just in my daily life, like I think I've made it very clear I don't tolerate these things. And I've had to make it clear to people that like this is not okay. And I think that's been very helpful because I think people now sort of like before I sort of let things slide and didn't really care. Now, well, no, I didn't care, but I was too scared to do it. Now, I think I'm more like if I see something, I'm more willing to stand up against it, stand up against the sort of injustices, for example, or like again, focus on educating people, and I think that's been helpful because it has really taught me to use my own voice, um, and because like it helps me ensure that I'm not like being complicit in oppression, and I think it's also been refreshing because I have now, because I'm more my authentic self and more able to use my voice, surrounded myself with people who I think genuinely also care about those things. Um, Whereas before, I don't think necessarily people I surrounded myself with understood those those values, and that can be really helpful because again, the people you surround yourself with, if they're um, hyping you up and they like help you feel authentic, that can also keep you going. Um, I think on top of that, it's also just inspired a lot more like confidence in me. I feel like I'm more articulate now. I'm more willing to say things as they are. And like of course that's beneficial in things like the classroom, but I think it's also just beneficial in your day-to-day activities because I think when it comes for you to standing up for yourself and like like even just like dealing with your own the way people try to oppress you and your own personal oppression, I think you have a little bit more confidence to stand up straight and be like, you know what, I'm not going to take this. And I think that that can be incredibly helpful. Like, I think an example I have is people were talking about a very famous celebrity who recently, I mean, this could apply to so many people, but he had sort of started to come under fire for like allegations of sexual assault and things like that. Um, and then he released a statement saying like, actually, you know what, like I threw out this case, so like, I'm actually innocent. And so, one thing that I was able to do is like educate people on the fact that just because like a sexual assault case gets thrown out does not mean that a person's innocent, and people can use their influence to sort of like get out of situations like that. And just because someone says they're innocent or just because they're able to manipulate the law in their favor doesn't mean that you should immediately go back to supporting someone who we know is capable of doing those things. And I was able to say that to people and explain to them how it's sort of oppressive to kind of go back to the status quo just because someone says they're innocent. And so that's one recent example that I've been able to use. But I think overall, it just makes you a more confident person and more able to sort of reside in the power that you have.
I totally agree. I'm still learning how to be, more articulate because again, I'm still a student, still learning, but for me, it's really just I still want to, so that's why I continue to do what I do. But like you were saying, I find it so okay. I remember, and again, I'm not 100% educated about this topic, but I do remember learning about how, like before we even evolved, like as humans, you naturally find community, you naturally stick with each other to survive, right? So you over time as you evolve, right, like you stick with these communities, you build culture, you build norms, taboos, whatever, and this is essentially you link this and correlate it to survival. Like this is the only way you can survive because if you're on your own, you're on your own, and that's terrifying. You need people, right? So when I started thinking of it that way, I started thinking of the communities around me and that I'm currently in, and why sometimes it's so hard to say the right thing, and why sometimes it's so hard to create these spaces or be just so authentic and upfront about how you feel, because I've noticed that even though it seems like, oh, it's not that deep, somebody just doesn't like you, which sometimes that generally is the case. In other people, it actually seems like this is my world. Like my world will go away if I say something, if I stand up for myself, because these are the norms and I have to stick to them. And I've seen that in real time with my own parents who are African in their communities. And I love my Sudani community. I love them, but I have to be honest, like with any community, there's a lot of toxicity. There's a lot of trying to keep the status quo. There's a lot of trying to keep you in line and control you. And there's a lot of reasons for why that is. It could be because of colonialism, colonization, and again, survival, trying to teach this generational trauma and trying to teach your kids to survive the same way you had to. However, with that comes no progression. Like you're too scared to ever say anything or do anything out of the norm. And it becomes so frustrating for me to try to explain that to some of the, adults in my life who come from all kinds of communities, because again, they just accepted their position and place in it. And I think for me, like like I said, community can be anything. It could be friends, it could be your class, could be whatever. For me, even with my own friends, I try to also, correct them if they don't know anything. You know what I mean? If they see something problematic, I respectfully am like, okay, that's actually not cool because of this, this, and this. And all they do is just say, oh, I didn't know that, and then don't do it again. And it's not like, I personally am not the biggest fan of cancel culture, just because I do think in most ways, actually, I feel like you cancel them right away before they even had the chance to learn about what they did was wrong and why it was wrong, and even had a chance to grow, because none of us are perfect, including me. Like, I've made many mistakes, I'm still continuing to make mistakes, and I'm just trying to give myself grace, because again, I'm really open to learning and expanding my knowledge. But again, it takes time, you know what I mean? I can't rush that process, especially since I most of my activism was me as a kid, right? Still very uneducated about a lot of topics, but what was making me do it and what was driving me was simple passion and honestly just trauma from certain experiences. It was just exhaustion, like being, like you said, the oppressor trying to drain everything out of you. So you just have to accept it. And so I'm really glad that you talked about that, because I remember we had a conversation about being discouraged and how to go about that. And I know you already touched on rest and all of that, but I was wondering if you've ever been discouraged, and maybe what you did about that to help yourself, or what if it made you even work even harder. Like what was that like for you?
I think one time that I really felt discouraged, um, here, I think I'm gonna use a different example because I already touched on sexual assault protest. Um, I think it had to do with in the library, one thing that was happening was they were trying to do like a sort of like queer positive book series. Um, and like they had this whole display of um queer authors that you could read. Um, and like I think for me, I thought it was really, really cool at the time. And I was like, wow, like I, I just like the fact that it's being censored, and that like apparently, like my library cares enough to do that, my school library. But then I remember just hearing people's comments, and it's over time it started to get to me because they would say things like, like, I'm not homophobic, but I feel like they're rubbing it in people's face too much. They literally said that. Or they'd say things like, do they really need to do all this? Um, and I would hear those comments. They weren't said to me, but more so just like out to the world in general. And I started to feel like, well, like what's the point? Um, like why do this then if people are just gonna say this or just be this ignorant? And I think what I learned over time is like I think the reason people were doing that was because they were sort of trying to process the fact that like the status quo wasn't being censored anymore, or that like their reality was being challenged in some way. And I think instead of seeing people getting upset about that um as like a reflection on me, or the fact that like I was a failure in some way or inferior, I was like, well, this is part of them learning to like lose their privilege in some way, and like see a more equitable world in some way. And I think that sort of helped me a lot, because that sort of helped me feel like, okay, well, instead of worrying about like being like something that people could quote unquote digest, I'm just going to stand in this and censor myself and not care what people say. And like people haven't always reacted favorably to that, but I think people learn to respect me over time. And so, like, for example, kind of after that, like, I would sort of just like be unapologetic when I talked about queerness. And um, I think, like, for example, in conversations, I would say, like, hey, this is homophobic and this is why. And I think things like that, where I would see people react negatively or react unfavorably, but I'd be like, okay, that's more of a reflection on them than me, was one way that I felt more encouraged to sort of just like keep going.
I love that. I had a very similar experience, because I think truly changing your mindset is what helps you get through the day. Like, I used to, sometimes words do get to you, especially when you're little and impressionable, right? So if people are saying, "Oh, you're doing too much. It's not that deep. You're starting issues. You're the problem." Like over time, you really truly start to believe that, and you're like, "Okay, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am a snowflake. Da da da, whatever." But like you said, that mindset change of, "Okay, this isn't actually my problem. This is the world around me," and it's not supposed to be egotistical or, oh, I'm never the problem. No, I can definitely acknowledge when I have made a mistake and, try to learn from it. However, I also stopped caring about being popular with people. I truly did not care because this is how I view it. And I don't know if this will help anybody else listening, but there's just no possible way for everyone to like you. There's just no way. Like, for that to happen, I truly believe you would have to be the fakest person alive because everyone has a distinct personality, right? Everyone attracts and repels, different kinds of energy and people and whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, if a bully was to like me, what does that say about me? You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that's
Yeah.
what I'm saying. Exactly. Like I personally don't really take it personal anymore when somebody gets mad at me for defending something or someone else, or if I just, respectfully, call them out on something. If they get mad at me and they, project all of that anger and self-hatred onto me, I can't view that as I'm the problem. I simply have to view that as you're not willing to listen, and I hope one day you will, but I'm not the one to deal with it, so I'm just going to leave you
Right.
alone. So
Yeah.
yeah, I personally think that anybody should try to just find your people. I think that's what I'm trying to say with community building, why it's so important, like you said earlier, was that being around like-minded people gives you that strength and reassurance that you're doing something right. And I don't think I've ever been able to do anything without other people. Like I've always had a support system either I created on my own or I was lucky enough to have around me. But having a support system is so crucial to your development because without it, you're honestly on your own trying to figure out all these complex life lessons,
Mhm.
and it's so discouraging. So I really appreciate you bringing that up and making room for that with yourself because we're always harder on ourselves and we're our own worst critics. So
Right.
yeah, I appreciate that. But is there anything else that you want to say or add on to before we end this?
Yeah, I would just say that like I feel like that if anyone out there is listening and is like I'm still finding my place, um, like first of all, like you have strength and you have power and you can create the change. Um, and so don't let anyone make you feel like you don't have that power. And especially as youth, I think people sort of like make us think that because of our age we can't make a difference. That's not true. And I think people will use their position or their title to say that you can't make change. That's not true. um, but I think at the same time, remember to honor yourself. And remember that if you need to take a rest, that's perfectly valid. Remember that like you don't need to let other people drain you. And that like you can prioritize yourself in this. And I think also if you just find something to keep you going or find your purpose and your motivation, I think that can really drive you. But yeah, I'm really excited to see like what the people around us can really create the changes we're gonna see.